By the turn of the 20th century, America was fully in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Electricity was now commonplace, and with its arrival in the cities, so came the capacity of the cities to employ and house more people than ever before. Women were now entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They found employment in structures such as the Ash Building in New York, which was equipped with all the latest technology: Otis elevators, Bell telephones, and Singer sewing machines. This building seemed to be a model of American ingenuity and achievement. But this was the Gilded Age, and masked behind this facade was corporate greed, cramped and unsafe working conditions, and a blatant disregard for workplace safety. It was a recipe for disaster. Disasters in the workplace were growing all too common. For example, over 1,000 coal miners were killed during the month of December 1907 alone. From miners to garment workers, laborers around the nation are becoming fed up with low wages and unsafe conditions. They now began to take a stand and organize. In the garment industry, a brave young woman named Clara Lemlich dared to take a stand. She worked in the Ash Building, which was home to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. In 1909, despite threats and intimidating tactics used against the workers by Ash Building owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris, she led a spontaneous walkout of 400 employees. The very next year, an agreement established a grievance system in the garment industry, but with many shops, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, being run by unscrupulous owners, workplace safety was still ignored. Sadly, many of these same brave workers that stood up for their rights would become martyrs to a cause that many of these young immigrant girls could not have possibly understood in terms of its scope and magnitude. "12,000 garments known as shirtwaist, a fashionable trend for working women, were being produced each week inside the Ash Building. Hundreds of working girls crammed into the upper floors of this building were helping to make wealthy men of Max Blank and Isaac Harris. But while a select few profited, many of the Triangle factory workers, girls as young as 14, mostly Italian or European Jewish immigrants, suffered through grinding poverty and continued to struggle with language and cultural barriers while supporting large families. They made perfect victims for both factory owners and slumlords. Desperate for employment, they endured personal indignities and exploitation that some, like Clara Lemlich, were finally taking a stand against. But at the close of the workday on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, a small fire in a bundle of scrap materials began to spread, possibly the result of a poorly disposed cigarette butt. With all the loose material in the factory strewn about, the fire spread rapidly. Before long, the top floors of the Ash Building were engulfed in a raging inferno. Starting on the 8th floor, the fire was beginning to rage when the call came to the switchboard operator to send word to the floors above. She immediately ran for help. The 9th floor workers received no warning.
And so, as the fire progressed, and we had a very fast-moving fire because of all the scraps, and the fire progressed upward onto this 9th floor, and when the people on the 9th floor found out there was a fire, there was a panic, and they couldn't get out because one exit was locked, and the crowd was pushing up against the door, and both exits were inward opening doors, which made it almost impossible for the people to get out. This is where the door was locked at the time of the Triangle fire, the Washington Place door. But today we can see that you have lit emergency exit signs, we have panic bars, we have fire extinguishers, and we even have a manual pull station.
As the others rushed to the window, they soon realized their doomed fate as they watched a metal fire escape crash to the ground below under the weight of those trying to get away. Those who awaited the firefighters were only left to discover that New York City had not a single ladder tall enough to reach them, nor could the water from the hoses. By the time the fire died out, 146 workers were dead. The survivors would relive those agonizing moments for the rest of their lives. Passers-by would have etched in their collective memories the desperate leaps of those from the ninth floor windows.
Then some more firemen came up and they told me to walk down, and when I came down, I saw quite a number of people jumping from the window.
Was your sister one of those who jumped?
No, my sister was burnt to death. She was so badly burned that we couldn't recognize her.
New York City would never be the same. With hundreds of tenement apartments and crowded factories atop its lofty buildings, New Yorkers were fully aware that a disaster of this magnitude could strike at any moment. Groups such as the Ladies' Garment Workers Union and the Women's Trade Union League had for years fought for better working conditions and protective legislation. The fire that tore through the Ash Building proved just how woefully inadequate the precautions and limited fire inspections were. In the days that followed, the dead were identified and the city reeled in shock and grief when it became painfully clear that due to irresponsibility and greed, 146 young women had perished. Protesters took to the streets, demanding action to safeguard the oppressed and to improve the deplorable conditions in factories, sweatshops, and tenements. Union workers offered testimonies and demanded Blankenharris be brought to trial. From the progressives to the conservative press, all called for reform. It was also evident that responsible action from strong unions with workers' rights in mind could have done much to prevent this tragedy. Workers would now be more conscious of their rights of obtaining safe working conditions. Even today, union workers look to the Triangle Fire as a seminal moment in their history and strive to recognize the martyred victims of this disaster.
100 years ago, on this very day, there was a fire where 146 young men and women lost their lives, and it is our obligation and responsibility to make sure we never forget what happened to those 146 workers.
Unions, progressive organizations, and anonymous contributors helped arrange a massive relief effort for families of the victims and injured survivors. An executive committee of the Ladies' Waist and Dressmakers Union helped distribute weekly pensions and cared for children of the victims who had nowhere else to turn for help. Together with the Red Cross, which collected funds from the general public, over $30,000 in aid was distributed. On April 11, 1911, Blankenharris were indicted on 7 counts and charged with manslaughter. The trial included detailed testimony from workers who claimed doors were locked and fire escapes inadequate at best. After a 23-day trial, Blankenharris were acquitted. Grieving families now felt not only the pain of loss, but the sting of injustice. The deadliest industrial disaster in New York City history was over in less than 30 minutes. Today, historians and labor rights advocates still honor the young workers lost to the tragedy and the changes in American labor law it sparked. Facing pressure from the union and continued public outcry, the New York legislature created a New York State Factory Investigating Committee, which passed strict fire code legislation. Also a direct result of the fire, the Life Safety Code was now enforced in all 50 states. Over a century later, the legacy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire remains as relevant as ever, especially in the United States where workplace safety has improved tremendously. However, while it may be tempting to look back at the shameful working conditions of the time as simply a thing of the past, in light of today's recent disasters in overseas sweatshops in places like Bangladesh, how much progress has the worker truly made in the last 100 years on the international level?